Hi everyone, in case you weren't able to make our presentation last Wednesday, here's a brief uh, QuickTime movie summary of what we talked about. So what we're doing here is talking about the Reformation through the lens of an exhibit called The Art and the Reformation, which is a traveling exhibit that's stopping in 3 places in the US. And I saw this particular exhibit at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, so that's what MIA stands for here. And we're going to talk about 2 aspects of the Reformation, one being how the Reformation changed education, and the second part is what I'm calling the Tale of Two Chests. So stay tuned to find out more about that. Here's what the opening of the exhibition looked like, and you'll note that there's a pretty dramatic drawing of God and the world and the title of the exhibition, and then some what are probably Thrivent execs who are standing near the entrance. So this is the stock photo actually from their website. This particular drawing comes from the very first page of Luther's Illustrated Complete Bible, which looks something like this. So you see on the left there's God overseeing the creation of the world, there's Adam and Eve and the animals and so forth. So that's how the exhibition began. Again, we're going to talk about the impact on education and a tale of two chests. The Reformation and the Renaissance, just to give a little background, was an era of great social change, and usually we consider this to be the period from about 1300 to 1600, roughly. Renaissance, if you don't remember from high school, means rebirth, but the rebirth of what? What are we talking about? One of the big emphases in the Renaissance was the rebirth of Greco-Roman culture. So people began to develop a great nostalgia for what life was like in the Roman Empire, how Europe was very powerful and had a lot of great art, had a lot of great architecture, life was grand. Couldn't we return to that? And so, modeled after that, during the Renaissance, was a lot of neoclassical art and architecture. So, a lot of sculpture that was modeled on Greco-Roman sculpture, a lot of architecture, including the building of domes, which hadn't occurred for hundreds and hundreds of years, modeled after Roman domes. It was also a period of great scientific discovery and learning. So, Luther lived in between Copernicus and Galileo, so he's a little bit before Galileo, but a lot is going on in terms of really developing the idea of science, and also along with that, realizing that the Greek philosophical conception of the world wasn't exactly accurate. So the moon was not made of ether, rocks didn't have souls that made them want to go down, that was caused by something called gravity. And so a lot of changes in kind of how the world was being perceived, a lot going on. There's also European contact with the Americas, so you may remember from history that Columbus sailed in 1492, so that's pretty close to 1517. This was sort of rocked the European world. And kind of a sad aspect of the Renaissance was a revival of European imperialism. So make Rome great again. Fight the Muslims, revive the Roman Empire. Unfortunately, Europe couldn't really agree on who should lead this revived Roman Empire, so sometimes it was the Spanish, sometimes it was the Portuguese, sometimes it was the French. So an era of great upheaval and unfortunately a lot of war. So education and learning. We have the printing press in 1440, quite a while before Luther, but not so terribly long that it still wasn't a pretty new thing. We had the publication of Bibles. So as you know, Luther translated the Bible from the original languages into German. And in this exhibit, we were able to see a copy of one of Luther's complete Bibles, complete illustrated Bibles. But you'll notice what has happened to the figure of God in this particular illustration. The owner of this particular volume was apparently, according to the plaque in the exhibition, a Calvinist and not too fond of images of God. So he must have taken an eraser or something and gotten rid of the image of God in his Bible, which I thought was very interesting. We also had the publication of Bibles in their original language. So this is a Christian copy of the Old Testament in Hebrew. And scholars in Europe didn't know Hebrew for hundreds of years prior to Luther, so people were rediscovering Hebrew, figuring out how it worked, and publishing copies of the Hebrew Bible. We also had publication of a lot of pamphlets and posters. So maybe if you couldn't afford a book, you might be able to afford a pamphlet. And if you couldn't afford a pamphlet or a book, you might walk past an interesting poster around town that might grab your attention and stop and look at it and read it. One thing that is important with all this proliferation of reading materials, there was a much bigger incentive for people to learn to read because there was actually something to read. So it was becoming more and more beneficial to know how to read, and more people were learning to read. And of course, Luther was a big uh, supporter of education, well, at all levels, and also for girls, which was something unheard of in his time. So he he was very much interested in people learning how to read. Here was a very interesting poster at the exhibition, not very complimentary of monks. So you can see that this man is a monk because he has what is called a tonsure, the special sort of bowl haircut that monks get. And obviously, Satan or some satanic or bird-like creature is calling the shots. He's telling what the monk is to say, so not very complimentary. But interesting. Might catch your attention if you're walking past this in town. These posters are also very rare because they were exposed to the elements, and very few of them have survived. Here's a copy of the 95 Theses in pamphlet form that dates back to 1517. So published very soon after Luther's publication of the 95 Theses, or his nailing them to the door or posting them on the door, or whatever he did with them. They quickly came out in pamphlet form. So these printers were very nimble people. They jumped on printing opportunities. Also, we have interesting cartoons. So this is a cartoon of the Pope riding a pig and blessing people with a handful of pig poo, which is an interesting cartoon and obviously satirical and not very complimentary of the Pope. Here's another illustration of Luther triumphing, I guess is a word, over Pope Leo X. So you'll see Luther on one side has what looks like a book in his hand, probably the Bible, and he has his learned professorial assistants kind of on the hill right below him. And then on the right-hand side, we have the Pope, who has the keys to the kingdom in one hand, note no Bible. He has a crown and is apparently being supported or held up by a bunch of Jesuits, which seem to be part of the Inquisition. And he's also backed up by a big army. So Luther has an army of scholars, and the Pope has, I guess, a real army. So it's an interesting kind of contrast, or again, very satirical look at the Catholic Church and what each side was about in the eyes of this artist. Also had, just in general, more illustrated works. So you've seen a bunch of examples of illustrations from books already. So if you didn't know how to read, like we all do, it's always fun to look at the pictures. So uh, books became more than just the printed word. There were also more illustrated works available. Let's talk just a few minutes about university reform. Unlike today, universities during the early part of the Renaissance were actually very conservative places. So we think of universities now as kind of the place where cutting edge research gets done and people debate new ideas, and there's new learning, and maybe universities are kind of at the liberal end of things. So that was not the case in the Renaissance. Universities were very conservative places and very much dedicated to preserving older ways of learning and the content of theology in particular. So theology was a big subject that you learned in university. And theology itself was dominated by the works of Thomas Aquinas, who was a Catholic theologian that lived from 1225 to 1274, and he published something called the Summa Theologica, which really was the major and more or less only textbook that theology students learned. His method of learning was something called scholasticism. This is probably more information than you want to know, but scholasticism was a melding of Greek philosophy and Christian theology. So largely it was a synthesis of the works of Socrates and Christian theology. And learning was done primarily by memorizing what were called disputations and carrying on debates. So, for example, you as a theology student might learn Thomas Aquinas's 6 proofs for the existence of God. So you would learn those, you would learn the rationale behind them. Then you would also learn what the objections to Thomas's um, proofs for the existence of God were. And then you would learn kind of the rejoinder to those objections. And then these would be recited in class. So you would kind of have a little pretend debate where one side was debating for the existence of God, the other side was objecting, and then the first side was telling about kind of the answer to the objections and why they were ultimately correct. So there was a lot of kind of pretend debating going on and a lot of memorization of specific arguments and how they worked and how to answer them. This was a system of learning. This guy, Frederick the Wise, was a powerful figure who had a residence in Wittenberg. He was one of the electors of the Holy Roman Empire, which was the loose confederation of German states in what is now modern-day Germany and sometimes in northern Italy. And he wanted to found a new type of university in Wittenberg. So he founded a university because he was a powerful man and he was rich and he got what he wanted in 1502. So if you think about the difference between 1502 and 1517, uh, the University of Wittenberg was pretty new when Luther was working. So as I said, he wanted to found a new type of university. It was the first university in Europe founded without prior church permission. So he founded his university and then later asked the church if it was okay. Because he had a lot of money and the church wanted to curry favor with him, they granted his permission, but he didn't wait for the church to tell him it was okay. And by the 1540s, he had several thousand students, and some people have speculated that for a period of time, the University of Wittenberg was one of, if not the largest university in Europe. So if and when you go to Wittenberg, you'll realize that it's a pretty small town in a pretty out of the way place. And this would be competing against universities long established in Paris, numerous universities in Rome and Vienna, and a lot more exciting places than Wittenberg. But obviously, Luther and his compatriots there were big draws, and everybody wanted to see what was going on in Wittenberg. And of course, this is how Frederick made his university very popular, by having it be somewhat controversial. But learning was still largely done by listening to lectures, and debating still was a huge part of the university. Certainly more so than we would find it to be the case today. And I think when we read a lot of documents from this period, we find that they are very argumentative, and they're a lot about theologians getting into what seem to us to be very arcane arguments. So that tradition continued on. One of the items on display was a debating platform from the University of Wittenberg. So this is later than Luther, in the Baroque period. I don't know the exact date on this. So this stands, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 feet tall, and is sort of a riser type arrangement where you could get maybe 4 people in the front row and 3 in the back, and where apparently they would arrange people and they would do their debating or their disputation from this debating stand. And ultimately, hiring Luther was probably Frederick the Wise's best decision of all. He hired him as a professor of Old Testament in 1512, which again was not too long before Luther posted his 95 Theses. So he hadn't been a professor there all that long before he was starting to make waves. Next, as I promised, I wanted to talk a little bit about A Tale of Two Chests, an indulgence chest and the community chest. So at the exhibition, there was an actual indulgence chest. So groups of preachers were dispatched from Rome to collect money for what are called indulgences, and this money was accumulated in a chest like this, and with numerous locks on it. So this is an actual chest where they collected the money for an indulgence. Now, here is my shot at trying to explain how indulgences work, and why they were so important, and why Luther resisted them so much. So here's sort of the average life cycle of your average Christian. When you are born in Christian thought, particularly in the medieval period, this was stressed greatly. You are born into original sin. So you are not born good, you are born evil, and you are bound for damnation from the moment of your birth. But at baptism, there was a cleansing from original sin. So after the point of your baptism, you are completely free of all sin, which is great, right? So you are in the good graces of God. However, you can fall away from the good graces of God by sinning. So I've called this subsequent sin. And in Catholic thought, there are 2 types of sin. Mortal sin, which if you commit a mortal sin and then you die, you are bound straight to hell. Or there are venial, less serious sins, which are problematic, kind of put you out of a state of grace. But if you would die after committing a sin, a venial sin, you would not necessarily go to hell. Of course, you have to differentiate and think about whether or not your sins are mortal or venial. So let's say I've sinned. What do I do? The solution is sacramental confession, where all sins, both in type and number, have to be orally recited to a confessor, to a priest. And then, after this recitation and a prayer of contrition or sorrow for committing the sins, the Christian is granted absolution. So you are restored into God's good grace, into what is called a state of grace, and importantly, you are given a penance to do. Now, in modern times, your penance might be something very minor, to say a specific prayer, do something nice to somebody you may have wronged. I don't know, it could be about anything. But in the medieval period and the period before Luther, penance could be a pretty big deal. So your penance might be to give X amount of money to the poor, or it might be, if you did something really, really wrong, you might be required to make a pilgrimage to Rome or Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or to the Holy Land, or do some other good deed for the church, finance a construction project, something like that. So, as long as you did your penance, you were in the clear, no problem. But let's say you've made your confession and you die, but there is something left on your tab when you die. You haven't completed all of your penances. Maybe you weren't in good enough health to make a pilgrimage to Rome, or maybe you didn't have enough money to give to the poor, or maybe I don't know, maybe you died before you could get around to it. Maybe you forgot. Maybe you forgot to list all of your sins in both type and number. So any number of things could go wrong in this process. And then if you die, as long as you're not in a state of mortal sin, you go to purgatory. And purgatory, particularly in this period, was thought of as a place of suffering, where you kind of suffered for the penances that you had not paid. However, the church granted your surviving friends and relatives the possibility of gaining an indulgence. So the church kind of had a list of things that you could do to gain indulgences, say certain prayers, attend masses, I don't know, any sorts of other things. And in Luther's time, because the Pope wanted to raise money to build St. Peter's, he came up with a special indulgence where you could just basically pay a fee and you would get an indulgence for the sake of one of your dead relatives. So if you're worried that she may be stuck in purgatory for a long time, buying an indulgence was definitely beneficial for her. In the Lutheran schematic, things have changed quite a bit. So the idea of original sin still sticks around, but in baptism, Christians receive forgiveness, deliverance from death, a new life in the Holy Spirit. And one of the major differences is that we're always saint and sinner all of our lives. I'm sure you've heard that before. But that people carry that sin around, and that really it's a daily struggle. And I think Luther in the Small Catechism talks about having to drown that sinful person every day. So it's something that we deal with day after day, and it's just part of life. But the point is, we don't have to worry about whether or not we're in God's good graces. So it's not about appeasing God or making sure you're in a pure status. It's that God graciously loves you despite the fact that you're a sinner, not that you've jumped through all the hoops. So we as Lutherans still confess sin, usually at the beginning of services. where we receive assurance of forgiveness and assurance of God's acceptance. So it's not a quid pro quo where, if we don't confess, we're not accepted by God, but there's no penance involved. So you don't have to go out and do anything to seal the deal on God's forgiveness. And then at death, we are received into God's grace. So for purposes of this discussion, the fact that there's no longer any penance is kind of important. So keep that in mind. In medieval society, the poor actually had a central function. And there were two types of poor people. There were the involuntary poor, or what we kind of think of as poor people, people that don't want to be poor, but have, for whatever reason, ended up being poor. And then we had what some people call the voluntary poor. So remember our monk from earlier on in the discussion here. Many monastic orders begged for money professionally. They didn't own any assets themselves. Any assets they had went to the order, and it was sort of their job to go in the street and to beg for money as a sign of their humility and their poverty, and this was seen as a way of advancing in holiness. So there were a lot of people begging for money, both people that really needed the money and people that didn't so much need the money but were begging for spiritual purposes, which is a little bit hard for us to get our head around. But if you're an actual poor person, think about the impact on somebody that doesn't really need the money but is also begging for the money, competing for your begging dollars, I guess. So in a way, indulgences worsened social inequality. Now remember, giving money to the poor was often a penance that you did. So indulgences were sort of a way of sometimes getting out of having to give money to the poor. Also, it was something that only people of means could afford. So, is it really fair that I get to get grandma out of purgatory because I have money and maybe you don't because you don't? So there are a lot of problematic ideas floating around with indulgences. And Luther directly addresses this in one of his 95 Theses. So number 43, he says, Christians are to be taught that he who gives or lends to the poor does a better deed than he who buys an indulgence. So rather than buying an indulgence, you should take care of the poor or lend them money. Make sure that you're looking after them. Another aspect of indulgences, and this particular indulgence that was going on in Luther's time, was the fact that the money did not stay in Wittenberg. It all went back to Rome and was used by the Pope to either beautify St. Peter's, to construct St. Peter's, to fund his armies, or to spend it on whatever popes spend money on at that time. So it didn't really do any good for the local poor people, either the voluntary poor or the involuntary poor. And one other interesting aspect of poverty at this period of time was the prevalence of so-called brotherhoods. And there were actually 21 of these in Wittenberg in 1520. It's a little hard to explain what a brotherhood is, but I'll do my best. It's kind of a lodge or a men's club. It's kind of an indulgence club in a way. So you would pay to join these clubs. Again, you had to have some sort of financial means to get in the club. You would pay your dues, and then the club would hire someone to say masses for you, to say prayers for you, that were particularly aimed at praying for you after you died. So if you're concerned about your eternal fate, one answer might be to join a brotherhood, this club, and then after you die, the club will ensure that there will be people, priests in church, saying masses for you or praying for you after you're dead, so you don't have to worry about or worry as much about the time you're going to have to spend in purgatory. Apparently, another interesting aspect of these clubs was that part of the money collected was also supposed to go to the poor, but that kind of fell by the wayside, and it seemed that more and more of the budget was being spent on beer. So these were also sort of drinking societies as well. And here's a good old Luther quote on these brotherhoods. If men desire a brotherhood, they should gather provisions and feed and serve a table of two of poor people. Um, So, in other words, if you want brotherhood, be in brotherhood with your neighbor, be in brotherhood with the poor. They should gather the money they intend to squander for drink and collect it into a common treasury. Then, in cases of hardship, needy and fellow workmen might be helped to get started. So, many people point to this quote from Luther as the first inkling of the idea of a community chest. Ultimately, Luther was able to convince the town council to begin this idea of a community chest. And one of the first steps is that all begging was forbidden. So if you're uh, either kind of poor person, no more begging. The answer instead is to go to the city, if you're not a monk, and ask for help. So a civic board was chosen to oversee this chest, and the idea is that all of the people of the town would contribute to the chest, and then from the chest, the board would oversee the distribution of money either to help out poor people or maybe to lend people some money so that for example, a young couple gets married and the guy decides he wants to become a carpenter but he needs specific tools and this costs money. You could go to the community chest board, ask for a loan to get started, and then once you were up and running and became an apprentice and were earning some money, you could pay the loan back into the community chest. So this is another indulgence chest. But this is a community chest. So in the exhibition, these two were fairly close together. So kind of contrasting the old idea of giving money to the poor through indulgences or giving money to your dead relatives through indulgences to this idea of civic involvement and taking care of your neighbor through this community chest. And it's interesting because there are multiple locks on this chest. You can see in the lid. And the idea behind this is that sort of like when you go to your safe deposit box at the bank, if you have such a thing, where there needs to be multiple keys to open. Um, Not just anyone can get into the money. There have to be multiple people present at the time. So a nice kind of division of responsibility there. And also in these chests, they would store the records of who had been loaned money, who had been granted money. So it was sort of like a community endowment, and the board would decide who the money needed to go to and who would be lent to, and so forth. And apparently, these proceedings were also kept within the board, so to try to cut down on jealousy and gossip within the town. So Luther was a big pusher of the community chest. It's an interesting idea. But again, once indulgences went away and penance went away, they needed to find another way to take care of the poor. So this was Luther's proposed solution. And apparently a lot of cities started similar projects.